Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you and see all of your bright and shining, smiling, beautiful faces. Well, most of your beautiful faces. Wanted to give you just a quick update on Aurora for those of you who have asked. She's doing much better, making some progress, able to move without her oxygen dipping real low, all good signs. So now she's just tired and has that wonderful recovery process that it takes a minute. So I appreciate all your prayers, appreciate everybody who's brought food. It was delicious. If I've gained a few pounds, it's your fault, but I'm very thankful for it. We're thankful for all that you guys have done for us. I'd like us to read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7 together today. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, and reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Hebrews chapter 11 is what we sometimes refer to as the hall of faith. For it records the actions of faith of mighty men and women of faith who, through their actions and through the text, continue to speak to us today, encouraging us to continue on in the faith. For their actions of faith confirm that God is faithful to his promises. And it's interesting that throughout Hebrews expresses that faith is not merely a cognitive exercise, that faith is action. It is the evidence of things not seen, as Hebrews 11:1 begins with, that we see faith, that it's something that should be evident in what we do and in how we conduct our lives, that it's not merely a cognitive exercise, but it's something that is lived out. And so as you read through Hebrews chapter 11, you'll notice that there are verbs associated with each person as to what they did and how they lived out, how they showed their faith. And notice here in verse 7, we see how Noah showed his faith. That is that Noah, in reverent fear, Noah constructed an ark. We could say that Noah built an ark, a story that most of us are familiar with, but if we're going to explore how Noah shows his faith and how we can learn from his faith, that means we need to look at his story, which begins in Genesis chapter 6. So if you got your Bibles, and I wonder, how many Bibles are there? What a fantastic sight. Genesis chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its breadth, 50 cubits. Its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark on its side. Make it with lower and second decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh. And you shall bring two of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kind, of the animals according to their kind, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind. Two of every sort shall come into you, and keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. So how do we know that Noah had faith? How do we know that Noah believed God? Well, because he built an ark. Why was Noah chosen to build an ark? There's other people to choose from. So why is Noah selected to build an ark? Above everybody else that could have been selected, why is Noah the one who's selected to build an ark? Let's look back at verse 8. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now notice the description in verse 11, that the earth is so violent, that it is so corrupted, that God says in his heart, I'm done with this people, I'm done with the entire world, I'm going to wipe them all out. But Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord because of his righteousness. It's almost as if that before Noah could build an ark, he first had to build a life of righteousness. And I find this particular passage so encouraging because of the description of how corrupt and how ridiculous the world was at that particular point in time, so bad that the text says that God was pained in his heart for having created man and wanted to wipe them all out. That evil has built up to such an extent that it permeates the entire world, and God says, I'm sick of it, I've had it up to here. And yet, in the midst of all of it, in the midst of the overwhelming evil, God sees the righteousness of one person. So if you ever wonder, does God see you? Does God see what I'm doing? Can God see you when I'm in the midst of everything that's going on? Can God see the righteousness? Well, yeah, apparently he can. Even in the midst of all of the evil and the buildup of wickedness within the world, that God still can see the individual acts of righteousness within those who pursue him. And so Noah is chosen because he has chosen to build a life of righteousness. And because he had built a life of righteousness, he has chosen to build an ark. Fast forwarding to Genesis chapter 7. Eventually the flood is going to come. And there's a description of the flood. It says that the fountains of the deep burst forth, and that rain came down from heaven. And it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. What do you call rain that pours down for 40 days and 40 nights? Back where I'm from, we call that raining cats and dogs. It's a storm. The description is not a gentle sprinkle that just keeps going on, but the description is that of this tumultuous storm that bursts forth and causes the whole earth to be flooded. But Noah is able to survive the storm because of how he chose to build. I'm reminded of what Jesus will say in Matthew chapter 7. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. Here Jesus expresses that how we build inevitably matters, for the storms will inevitably come. Here in Arizona we have, most years, maybe it's not so much this past year, but most years we have monsoon. And the winds come and the rains come, and it seems to test everything. It tests the roofs on houses. It tests how well the drains are flowing. It seems to test everything that is made, for that's what a storm does. A storm tests how things have been constructed. And inevitably, things that have been constructed well hold up, and things that have been not constructed well or have fallen in disrepair inevitably struggle a little bit in those storms. The question is, what is the storm? What are the storms to which Jesus refers? For he says that the storms inevitably come, but what are those? One is, of course, the storms of life. Now, you all have experienced them, those times when it seems that the winds are blowing and they're howling and the rain comes pouring down and it feels like you might fall apart. The storms of life. But I think there's another storm as well. For throughout the Old Testament, at times God's wrath is depicted as a storm. You might consider Jonah. Jonah, if you're familiar with the story, he's called to go to Nineveh and decides that, nope, I don't want to go anywhere but there. And so he hops on a boat and goes the complete opposite direction. And the text reads that a storm was hurled by God at him. It was God's wrath. That God's wrath is sometimes depicted as a storm. So what Jesus expresses here is that both the storms of life and ultimately the storm of God's wrath will come upon the earth at some point in time. And the question is, how have we built our house? For those storms will test it. And either we will have built well or we will have built poorly. I want us to spend some time today looking at how Noah built. Because he built his life in righteousness, and we see that play out with how he builds the ark. How did Noah build? And I want us to look at how we might follow his example and build our lives to be ready for the coming storms. First thing we see with Noah is that he built by following God's instruction. Let's look back at Genesis chapter 6. Beginning in verse 15. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark is 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark on its side. Make it with lower and second and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So how did Noah know what to do? How did he know what to build? How did he know how to construct an ark? How did he know what would be needed in order to be able to survive the coming flood? Well, God had told him and gave very specific instructions as to how he was to craft this ark, how he was to build this ark, and it was a mammoth boat. Across America, we find that biblical literacy continues to decrease. And not just amongst America, but amongst those in America who would claim to be Christians. We find that biblical literacy is quite abysmal. If we are to build in such a way as to survive the coming storms of life, that would mean that we would need to be reading the Word of God that depicts the instructions of how we are to live. For how are we to build if we don't know what he says, and how we don't know what he says unless we read that which he says? If you're not already regularly reading the Word of God, I want to encourage you to start today. Even if it's just a couple of verses. Start today, for unless we regularly read the Word of God and seek to implement that which we read, we cannot possibly build, and we cannot follow Noah's example to build our lives in such a way as to survive the coming storms. I'm reminded as a kid, there was one particular movie that when we went to my aunt's house, I wanted to make sure to watch, because she was the cool aunt that had all of the Disney VHSs stacked yay high. And there was one particular one I always wanted to make sure to find, and that was The Sword and the Stone. It depicts King Arthur and King Arthur before he gets to his round table. King Arthur and Merlin. And there's one particular scene that I have grown to really wish was possible as an adult. Merlin sees that King Arthur has lots of chores to do before he can go out to play. And so Merlin comes in and he casts a spell upon the dishes, and lo and behold, the dishes start washing themselves. They line up and dunk themselves and dry themselves and put themselves away. And as a kid, I always thought it was pretty cool. But as an adult, if there were a spell I could cast to make the chores do themselves, it'd be great. That's why I have you. But we all know that that's not possible. We all know that the only way chores get done is if we do them. We all know the only way that dishes get put away is if we take the time to take the dish and put it in the cupboard. We all know that the only way to get the dirt and the grime and the filth off is if we take the soap and put it on and wash it ourselves. But unless we do the work, nothing gets done. And the same is true of building. Have you ever found yourself thinking, man, whenever I finally become the Christian I want to be, when I finally can be the man that I want to be, when I finally can be the woman that I want to be, I'm going to do blank. But it turns out that unless we put in the work, it doesn't happen. That unless we are building according to the instructions that God has set forth, that nothing gets built and that it all just stays where it is. That if we are to survive the coming storm, it requires putting in the effort to build, first of all, by laying a foundation of Christ. That is, by accepting him, putting him on in baptism, and having that foundation of him, and then living the rest of our lives striving to implement what we see in the biblical text, so that we might build according to God's instructions and be prepared for the coming storms. Notice the second way that Noah built. He built by obeying despite his reservations. I want us to look back at Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as, notice that, yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Events as yet unseen. What are these unseen events? There are a couple of options. One might be rain. Because in Genesis chapter 2, the text says that it hadn't yet rained and that there was a mist coming up from the ground. And we don't encounter rain again, or the word rain again, until Genesis chapter 7. Not the only option, though. Another option would be a worldwide flood. For up to this point, there has been no worldwide flood. In fact, God will say there will never again be a worldwide flood that will destroy all of life. So it could be rain, it could be the flood, it could be the events surrounding the flood. When was the last time you saw animals marching 2 by 2? When was the last time you saw animals, because if you remember there are 2 of each kind, predators and prey. When was the last time you saw predators and prey exist, not for just a couple days, but for more than a year in one place together, without one killing the other? Maybe it's the rain, maybe it's the events surrounding the flood, maybe it's the flood itself, whatever it is, there are events that have not yet been seen, and Noah is told to prepare for those events. The ark was not built in a day. We're not told exactly how long it takes, but some have guesstimated it to be between 50 and 70 years. 50 to 70 years of every day coming out and beginning to build on this ark. 50 to 70 years of every day coming to build on an ark, preparing for something that you've never seen before, but God told you was going to come. I wonder if Noah ever had moments where he wondered, man, is this ever going to happen? I've been building this boat for a long time. I mean, after all, what is this flood thing that God keeps talking about? Have you ever felt like God's taking a long time to come through? Maybe you've been praying for something and it just seems to not be happening. Or maybe you've been looking at the words which Jesus said that, behold, I am coming soon, and you're going, well, it's been 2,000 years. And it seems like it's taken forever. But what Noah teaches us is that God is true to his word, that he always does what he says he's going to do. And he always does it as the perfect time. It just so happens that the perfect time is not according to our timetable. And so what we learn from Noah is the importance of continuing to build faithfully, even when we as humans find ourselves going, man, it sure seems like it's been taking a long time. Even when we find ourselves asking the questions, is this ever going to happen? What's the point of doing this anyways? That even if we find ourselves asking the questions, if we are to build faithfully, it requires continuing to build faithfully despite our own questions. Third thing Noah does is he continues to build and obey despite the pressure that he would have experienced. Remember, the text says in Hebrews 11 that it was events yet unseen. It doesn't say they were just unseen by Noah. It was events yet unseen by the entire world. If you've ever been to the Ark Encounter, it's there in Kentucky. And if you haven't been, I want to encourage you to go next time you find yourself in that neck of the woods. And what you're going to discover is that it is a mammoth boat. In fact, you'll see it long before you get to the turnoff to actually get to it. You can see it from a mile or two away easily. It's enormous. If you haven't seen it, to give you a frame of reference, think about Cardinal Stadium. Now, the Ark is bigger than Cardinal Stadium, but it'll help us put it in our minds. On a clear day here in Arizona, if you go over to the White Tanks and you climb the White Tanks, you can see Cardinal Stadium. People could see the built that Noah was building, the ark that Noah was building. Remember how long it took him? 50 to 70 years. People tend to be curious creatures. I wonder how long it was before somebody came by and saw Noah building and asked, hey, Noah, what you doing? I'm building a boat. Why? Because there's going to be a flood. Really? Okay. A year goes by, 2 years go by, the same person comes by. Noah, you still building that boat? Yeah. Why? Going to be a flood. You sure? It's been 2 years, it still hasn't happened yet. 10 years go by, 15 years go by, 20 years go by, 30 years go by. Still, Noah, what you doing? You still building on that boat? And at some point, curiosity moves from just curiosity to light teasing. And from light teasing, it moves to downright almost cruelty. And I wonder how many times Noah, as he walked by, because in 1 Peter we learn that Noah preached about the coming flood. I wonder how many times Noah on his way to the grocery store walked by only to have people snickering behind his back because Noah's still building that boat. I wonder how much pressure Noah felt especially since he himself had to be wondering, what are these events? Yet despite the whispers, despite the questions that were asked of him, despite perhaps the pressure to look at loony Noah, despite all of that, he continued to build as he knew he should, continued to build as God had instructed in preparation for what God had said was going to come. Who benefited from Noah's building? Well, it's obvious that Noah benefited. He survived the flood. His family benefited from his building because they too survived the flood. And ultimately, the entire world benefits because humanity was saved because of Noah's faithfulness to build. And one of the things we learn from Noah's building is that as we build faithfully, our building impacts not only ourselves, but impacts others who are around us. It impacts our families. For fathers that build their lives well impact their children. And mothers who build their lives faithfully and righteously impact their kids. Husbands that build their lives faithfully and seek to build according to God's plan impact their wives, and wives that build according to God's plan impact their husbands. That as we choose to build faithfully, we impact the family that's around us. And ultimately, as we choose to build righteously and faithfully, we impact the world that is around us as well. For Jesus said that you are the light of the world, that you are the salt of the earth. That how we choose to live gives light and gives salt to the entire world. In other words, that how we choose to build impacts the world that is around us. I remember as a kid, growing up back east in Tennessee, we had these sirens that would occasionally go off. It was tornado sirens. Anytime there was a tornado that was on the ground or a tornado that was sighted in some way, these tornado sirens would go off, alerting you that, hey, it's time to take shelter. And so we would take shelter in our bathtub. I remember every time the tornado sirens would go off, we'd grab our mattress, go over to the bathtub, hold it over our heads, and sit in the bathtub, assuming that it would survive a tornado. Looking back, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't. But nevertheless, we felt like it would, and so we felt a little bit safer. We were trying to prepare ourselves for the storm that was coming. One of the things that the Bible makes clear is that there is a storm coming, that the sirens have already started to go off, that the storms of life are here and that they will inevitably come. And that ultimately the storm of God's wrath that will come upon the earth is also on its way. The only question is, how have we built? And how are we building? Will we be ready for the coming storms? Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most. The one who sacrificed everything so that you might have a relationship with him and might be able to build your life on that foundation and survive those storms. And there's nothing that would excite us more than to help you begin that journey, which starts at baptism. Or perhaps you're here and you haven't been living as you should and you want to make a change. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.